Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This is Tuesday, December 22nd, 2020. And since this is our last day before the holiday break, it kind of functions like Fascism Friday. Kind of does.
Yes.
So we could call
and we thought we needed to bring people some good Christmas cheer.
Tyranny Tuesday, Totalitarian Tuesday.
Ooh, there we go.
we could go German fascistic and call it Teutonic Tuesday, which fits into the theme a little bit more.
Yes.
Because most Knights and Dungeons and Dragons type games are based on Teutonic sort of figures.
Tumultuous Tuesday. It's Gus's idea. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yep. Tumultuous Tuesday. Terrible Tuesday is probably good enough. Just to introduce ourselves, I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I direct the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And, you know, on an up note, right, last night was the solstice, and Deborah and I were determined to see the conjunction.
Where did you go how far did you have to go?
So I thought we might have to go as far as South Dakota, but we only had to go a little beyond Mankato. So we went southwest of the cities. Wasn't too bad.
An hour and a half drive.
Yeah, it was about an hour and a half.
So for those who aren't familiar with southern Minnesota geography,
right?
In the Midwest, an hour and a half is nearby. I know that if you're on the East Coast, it's different. Maybe an hour and a half is if it's congested traffic, but here we don't have that as much.
Yeah, if you're in Northwest Minnesota, an hour and a half is a quick trip to the bathroom.
Yeah, I mean, heading into town can be an hour and a half straight shot at 65 miles an hour.
Yeah,
in some parts. So
yep. Anyway, it was awesome. It was like so worth it, and really beautiful. I kept thinking of all those people in 1226 that were watching that, and it was great. So that was a good thing. That was a good thing. The planets don't seem to care about our disease-ridden failed state. They still keep spinning, doing their thing.
Mm-hmm.
So today, what we want to get into actually comes from this very interesting analysis that I read the other day. So I thought we'd bring it up. We've talked a lot about what's going on in the United States, particularly around the pandemic, around Trumpism, around all these people who have kind of lost their minds, and what's the explanation for that? What's a good model for that? We've talked some about the reality TV model. And then I read this thing the other day, which I just thought was great and very fascinating. So I thought we would talk about it. And basically, what was posited is that essentially something like QAnon and these various conspiracy theories function just like a virtual reality role-playing game, such as one plays online,
or an alternative one where like a very immersive, like LARPing.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, for those that are not familiar with these games, there are many of these. Sometimes they're called these massive multiplayer games, and you get into online and there's a world, right? So people will talk about world building. Of course, something like Dungeons and Dragons was, one of probably the biggest one before video games.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get into this world, and then you are a character in the world, and there's all of these things going on, and there's good guys and bad guys, and there's adventures, and there's different things happening, and there's different concepts in the world, right? So there may be different religions or different political alliances and all of this, and basically, what this guy was positing is that essentially people who have been absorbed into the conspiracy world of dumpism are basically lost in a virtual reality game, and that all of these people and ideas, things like socialism or people like Biden or the police or Antifa, are not real things anymore. But they are just objects and characters and concepts within this game.
Well, I mean, they're like right wingers. Well, it's a broader term than that, but like referring to people who aren't in the know as non-player characters. So a non-player character within a game, like if you kill another young player who's real, like, and you kind of just attack them to get their gold, it's kind of a dick move. Like, people do that, but you kind of shouldn't. But non-player characters, they're not real. You can do whatever you want to them, and it's kind of funny. So like, there's this idea that somehow these lesser thans aren't fully real people. They're just part of the AI or the script from the game.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so that, right. So, again, when you talk to somebody that's lost in this world, and you'll like say to them, well, what is socialism? Like, and they have no idea, right? They have no idea what socialism is. They'll say, Biden is an extreme leftist socialist, right? Which is like,
Would be
I mean,
so
I
amazing.
can't even say it without laughing. It's such a joke, right? But again, in the game concept, if socialist just means any bad guy that's against you, then yeah, he's a socialist. He's part of this alternate religion within the game world. And I think that this is an extremely helpful model. I think that this is very kind of accurate, and is kind of predictive and explains a lot of things that we see going on. And that's the thing in science about a theory isn't what's true. The value of a theory is whether or not it's predictive. And so a theory, isn't expected to completely explain all of reality. It's just meant to help us in our understanding because it can predict things. And yeah, so I like this one.
Yeah, and I think that works beyond the QAnon thing. Like, I could see how larger society, like your moderates in the United States, also are working within the confines of like it's like a rules-based system that doesn't quite exist, right? So, but in this case, it's particularly helpful to analyze because back in the day, it used to be much more common to refer to people's worldviews. And that can be a helpful way of framing things, but it doesn't go far enough because still the idea of a worldview is we're looking at the same objective reality, but we each have our own templates or grids over which we analyze it. And what that does is it kind of still treats things, we're like all roughly in the same world, just interpreting it differently. But when you get to the point where you have these inner constructs of our own consciousness that we're projecting out, like you can't assume that you and I share the same worldview exactly. But you can start noticing that we play by the same kinds of rules. And it is kind of helpful. And the other way I think it's helpful, we were talking about this before, if I'm working within my system of way of understanding things, and I look at a Trumper using the Dungeons and Dragons kind of alignment chart, I might say, oh, they're lawful evil, or they're chaotic evil. they're bad dudes, right? But within their own game that they're playing, whether they realize it or not, they're all paladins. So paladins are knights that can also heal, and you can only be a paladin, at least in the old rules, if you're lawful good. And they all think they're lawful good, and they think that people like communists And anarchists are goblins and orcs that need to be eradicated. And it just so happens everyone who's not a Trump supporter is an goblin or an orc, or maybe some sort of beholder or other nether beast. Like, it's kind of because they're evil to be vanquished. And they don't see that as a bad thing to do, because evil has to be vanquished.
Right. Yeah. And so, I do think it's important to state that in many ways, this is a logical extension of what human beings and human systems do.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's not, we've talked about things like the ego process. We've talked about things like formation. We've talked about, the powers of systems to help create who we are and to help stifle our imagination and limit us. So, in many ways, this is an extension of that process. The difference, though, is that it really sort of amps up that process kind of one other level, right? So it's like in a game, you level up, right? So it's kind of like leveling up in a game, right? And that the what we have seen with the creation of virtual reality, right? The creation of the internet, the creation of, and people have been talking about this, everyone's walking around, they're staring at their phones, they can't talk to each other, they text each other. Right. We are becoming increasingly absorbed into this virtual reality that we have created. And this then becomes the logical extension of that. Right. So, now and people will say, wow, I played that game for like 8 hours and I was just lost in this world. And when they come out of that, they know that they were playing a game and now they're back out into the real world. But what if everything becomes a game? Well, right? You never come out.
And that's right, because and we've talked about why people love conspiracy theories. Is this world sucks. It's complex. I have no idea what's going on most of the time. I'm so confused. Right. And so all of a sudden a conspiracy theory arrives and it's like, no, well, it's simpler than you think. I can explain it all. And so people find that compelling. I can find it compelling. There's a reason I'd rather read or play a game than live my life sometimes. We all can relate to that at a certain level. But if all of a sudden you see it's, in the anime world, it's called isekai. One day you die, you're middle management in a Japanese office building, you die, and you're reincarnated as a 12-year-old boy on a magical planet where you're overpowered. It's like all these Trump supporters woke up with this new power. And in these sort of anime, within this genre, that character now who's overpowered, they get to be their fullest selves. So maybe they were kind-hearted, now they get to be the hero. So everyone gets to be the hero of the new Trumpian narrative if they follow Trump. The rules are simpler. You're able to name the enemy in a much clearer way. And if you just can eradicate them, then you're eradicating evil from the world and you can finally create utopia. It sounds wonderful. If it weren't destructive and oppressive, it would be great if you could just wake up to a world where all you have to do is eradicate evil and then all the good things would happen, where you get to be part of making it happen and you're kind of a hero.
All right, we got a lot of comments.
Mm-hmm. Going back to CK, game theory, behavioral economics, normative economics. Again, just within our regular real world, we think economics has we apply rules and game theory to real life stuff all the time. And so it doesn't quite fit reality, but we still have to work. We tend to treat the models or the maps as though they're reality. So this is an extension of that. Sarah's likes role-playing games, just not when it's conspiracy theories.
Right.
That kind of takes the fun out of it if you know the consequences of your actions. Gus writes, there's a really fantastic episode of the podcast Reply All that explores this idea of QAnon as an ARG, alternative reality game, or MMP. It's episode 166. It kind of builds off of episode 122, which is their first explainer episode on QAnon. Sounds perfect for nerds out there who radical leaning nerd people. Check it out.
And more than that, the fact that you can pull up those podcast numbers is super impressive, Gus.
I just assume that Gus is sitting in a chair with wires plugged into like a helmet thing, and he's just
He's like the library of podcasts.
Mm-hmm. CK writes, it's a simulation motif, and we, the people, are the non-player characters.
Yeah.
Yes. Kathleen writes, we seem to have a deep need for stories. Yes, we also want to participate in the story even when we know it isn't real. Now, this is tricky, like, because stories create structure, and reality tends to not fit stories that well. So this is why histories tend to reflect specific worldviews and orientations towards like what you believe the goal to be. And so that can always clip off things, but we have to function that way. Otherwise we can't find meaning. Part of the problem is some of these stories are crap. Some of these stories.
Well,
yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Well, and the other big part of the problem, right, is that, you know, and some people want to blame this on, you know, postmodernism, you know, this sort of idea that everything is subjective, right? Mm-hmm. Nothing is real. You know, everything is fake. Everything is an idea. Everything is a story. Mm-hmm. The problem is, and so it's very easy to slide into this, you know, and that in a way that sort of prepares, you know, it's like the slip and slide, you know, those toys where there was that water thing and you jump and you go sliding down the slip and slide. It's kind of like that notion has prepared all of us for this phenomenon because, you know, if you buy into that in the extreme, then you're just like, well, I'm not playing a bad game. You're playing a bad game. We're both playing a bad game. Only my game is the right game, right? And you get into this thing where sort of nothing is real. There's no evidence for that, actually. You know, and one of the things, and this was before we got on, this was what I was saying about the scientific method, which is what's so powerful about it, is that it essentially says, okay, let's look at this piece of the world. You know, we could say, let's look at your story, let's look at your model, and then let's apply testing from the outside that other people can look at. And let's see what's going on, right? And so you have external validation or non-validation of your theory and your story. Mm-hmm. Now, when you do that, you actually begin to engage what is this greater, quote, objective reality. And you know, we just have seen the last couple of days a great example of this in terms of this game, right? So Fox News and Newsmax, you know, have been blasting all these bullshit conspiracy theories about the election, right? On and on and on, and saying, oh, yeah, the election was rigged. The voting machines are terrible. Well, so one of these voting machine companies finally, you know, grew a pair and, you know, wrote to Newsmax and to Fox News and said, we're going to bankrupt you guys with lawsuits for defamation because you're telling everybody that, you know, our voting machines destroyed the election and there's zero evidence of that. And if you don't retract this, you know, we're going to sue you for hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, that was suddenly this external thing of reality coming in from the game, like this popped the bubble of the game. And both Newsmax and Fox News, and these segments are hilarious, you know, now suddenly are running these segments going, oh, you know, we've had all these people coming on telling all these theories about the election. By the way, we found no evidence that any of them are true.
Well, and this is funny because now, remember back in the good old days when we just dump all over Fox News as being right wing?
Right.
Well, then within this way of they're the moderates, and then Newsmax
they're the centrists,
kind of right wing, and then now everyone's migrating over to the One America Network, whatever the one that pretty much has, you know, like Nazi egos on the logo almost. They're just so subvert. And this is, but you know, looking at it though, it makes sense. So here, you know, you're fighting for good and truth, and those deep state socialists, Jewish people are able to sue, which is what they do, to stop them. And these cowards, These cowards care more about money than truth. And so they've caved in. So we need to, they're part of the enemy now too. Anyone who's not with us is against us, and they're part of the enemy.
Yeah.
Now, getting to the comments. Stories. Susan writes, Brene Brown says to ask ourselves, what story are we telling ourselves to get beyond ego to the truth? I think it's important to think about, well, what,
right.
that's
a process of awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, developing some awareness.
And a lot of therapy kind of approaches do this on an individual level, like cognitive behavioral therapy or narrative therapy. But we have to not just look at what story am I telling myself to make, these internal things, but looking at society kind of operates this way too. Like, what are the collective stories we tell, and who do they serve? What do they accomplish? And why am I invested in it? Like, those are questions that people rarely ever ask themselves because they assume it's just true. CK prefers 5th edition rules. I never played past the 3rd edition. I'm sorry. I don't even know what 5th is exactly. Except for I know that paladins can be evil now, I think, right? Isn't that part of it? Anyways, Stefan writes, fascinating how right-wingers build their own moral world and also factual world in which they live. It's not only what is good and evil, but what is factual and what's happening, like who won the election and many other things.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and what this guy who wrote this was saying is that the game is expanding to fit the space of all reality, right? And so that's where, this is why I like this theory, because it's predictive, right? So there are all these people that are saying, like, I don't know what happened to my friend. Like, they're just gone. You can't talk to them. I can't even engage. There's no point of contact anymore. Like, I don't get this. Well, this is a theory that explains that really well. So if the game is expanding to fill all of reality, right, like Stefan is talking about, then when everybody is in the game and everybody has characters and every event and every theory is part of the game. So now you come along to talk to that person. You used to be their friend, operating in some sort of consensus reality. Now you're just an evil character in the game. And suddenly your relationship is completely different because it's now based on that rather than based on some sort of engagement with a reality outside of the game space.
Yeah, and just, most role-playing games these days are the grandchildren of Lord of the Rings and its world. And just think about how black and white that is, right? So in it, like Saruman, all these people are just pure evil. And then there's orcs and stuff that are pure evil. And then there are orcs and goblins that used to be elves and human beings that were turned into Uruk-hai warriors. But they're the corrupted people who once were good, and now they're pure evil. Now, this is the way they see things. Like, we're the ones who've become corrupted and are evil. Now, it'd be tempting just to kind of flip the script and I know I don't want to get into horseshoe theory or equivalencies here, but there is a tendency among some people on the left just to flip that and forget that we're wrestling against systems. And so we'll think, well, that person's become a goblin now and must be part of the people who are cold. Like, there isn't, and every ideology has this tendency to become so rigid in its rules. But right now we're seeing the gamification of this far right-wing thing. And it makes sense that the more under attack someone gets, the more they cling to ego, and the more they cling to stories that make them important in the story, where the story makes sense. And so we're seeing that, like, this is capitalism under siege to them, and now it's going to its logical conclusions.
Yeah.
It's correct.
And whiteness
under siege, patriarchy under siege.
Yeah.
I mean, even just a woman being a doctor, like from a PhD, is threatening now.
I know. All right, we're falling behind on the comments. This is like a game. The comments come in and we fall behind, and then we lose.
I know the truth, Adam writes. Paul writes, like the best simple line from the OA, this is a bad world. OA is on Netflix for people who want to watch that. Adam writes, Paul, I don't believe it that is a bad world. I have to remind myself it's not the world I have an issue with, but capitalist, colonialist, imperialism. Catherine writes, the funniest thing about the group RPGs is that you create reality together by the choices you make and solve problems and puzzles together. This is how conspiracy theories take on a life of their own, and why QAnon's method of slowly releasing obscure hints that followers have to puzzle over and hunt for together is so effective. It is gamification of, you're right, that's
reality.
Yeah.
And you see this, like people will get on these different, threads and they'll be like, I found something else. I got a clue today. I found this cool little thing. Like I saw this certain piece of garbage by the side of the road, and that must have been discarded by the election officials as they were faking their ballots. Yeah.
Well,
and it's this fascination, right? And it's this endless adrenaline rush, and it's, fun and exciting. And yeah.
Well, that's why if you're not a true believer, all this, like, you can't tell if it's a joke or not. Like the idea that Monster Energy drink has the 666 embedded within it, or that Johnson and Johnson or Procter Gamble is owned by Satanists. I used to believe that Procter and Gamble was owned by Satanists because, like, in the far right wing charismatic Pentecostal world, like Satan is behind stuff, and like the closer you get to the center of the conspiracy, you find out that there's outright Satanists controlling things.
Right.
Which is just effed up. You don't need that. Jeff Bezos doesn't have to
worship the
devil to be like bad.
Yeah. What do you mean by effed up? What is that?
It's from Battlestar Galactica. It's fracked up.
Oh, okay. Got
it. Umberto Eco, 14 Properties of Fascism. The 11th one said, everyone is educated to become a hero.
Yeah.
I encourage people to check out, just look up Umberto Eco, Properties of Fascism. I'm not sure I track 100%, but it's definitely a helpful rubric for analyzing things. Ceres writes, I think the impulse behind the coming virtual thing, while it's new, is not that new. What we call game theory ARG is a revisit of spirituality. Yes. And occults. Yep. This is an intensification.
That's what I said. It's a continuation of a lot of these kinds of things, and and I think that's why it's being so successful in America, right? Mark and I were talking before. I said, in order to own people and brutalize them and rape them and kill them and separate their families and sell their children, like you have to enter a pretty psychotic worldview.
Yes.
And so there is this thing in American whiteness that, is predisposed to entering these kinds of incredibly twisted, horrible reality spaces. And it's just that now this technology that we've got, allows the whole thing to be supercharged, which is, I think, what we're seeing.
Well, there's kinds of things that contribute to this. Like one of them is this, since the Enlightenment in particular, Western thought has assumed that politics and religion are separate realms. Like a great scholar on this is Talal Assad, who's coming from the Muslim world where there wasn't such a strong break. And what happens is if all of a sudden you have like religious categories and myth categories over here, which are kind of made up, but then over here, what I'm living in is real reality. Then I'm blind or lacking perception over how my way of living can be very mythic. So you have people buying into these mythologies and spiritualities without being able to label it as such. And so they're immune from the critique of it. So like you tell someone who's a Trump supporter they're a cultist, they think of what they know what a cultist is. And so then they're like, that doesn't apply at all because they just live in a different kind of set of rules. Adam writes, the sad thing is when it comes to the reality of the issues we face and the roots and history of this reality, folks tune out. It's true. Our culture develops allergies to the truth. Remember, conspiracies really are planned and executed every day. It's true.
Yeah. And, and so the other fertile ground for this, and Adam, you mentioned this earlier about capitalism, is that, when somebody is making billions of dollars during the pandemic and millions of other people are slipping into poverty and losing their homes and getting sick and dying and losing their jobs, it's not very hard to believe that there's some kind of conspiracy afloat to make this happen. Right now. The sad thing is, and this is the interesting thing in this particular kind of role-playing game, and I've seen this so much throughout the pandemic. It's very easy to get mad at the wrong people.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it's very easy to get mad at, the governor who's telling you to put on a mask, and not to get mad at Trump and a capitalist system that is, killing hundreds of thousands of people and destroying your community and your economic livelihood. Um, but yeah, the reality of end stage capitalism makes it very easy, I think, to slip into this kind of thinking that some big bad thing is going on, because in fact, some big bad thing is going on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a question of, what is the big bad thing, and what, how do we analyze that and understand it?
Paul writes, I don't want to spoil the OA for you if you haven't seen it, but kind of specific to that show. The idea is that the appeal to the wild conspiracy is grounded in the notion that the quote unquote real world is corrupted. And so we have to restore it to its original uncorrupted form. And I think you did a good job kind of giving part of the zeitgeist of that show without spoiling too much. And unfortunately, it was canceled, so I don't get to see where it goes. Sarah's writes, if 45 really is fighting against the deep state, Julian Assange would have been pardoned already.
Yeah, there we go.
Adam writes, the actual historical and proven conspiracies are scoffed at, while stories of lizard people eating babies are accepted. On a related note, we need language that counteracts the language that conspiracy means wrong or outlandish. The CIA feeding crack in the black and brown neighborhoods is a conspiracy, and it's not a theory. Voter suppression is a conspiracy. Redlining, eugenics doctors behind vaccines. I could go on and on. They're all historical, factual, literal conspiracies. The Pope dividing the New World between Portugal and Spain. Doctrine of discovery being the foundation for a lot of our property laws. The enclosure of the commons. There's all these things that if you tell someone, they think you're just making up some sort of wild crap. And they're all very determinative historical realities. So good point, Adam. Series writes, game theory is a great explanation on how white European trauma and guilt has been projected onto the world. That's right. CK writes, from a psychological standpoint, the idea of overwriting trauma and creating a different narrative.
Yeah, it's very dissociative. Yeah, and then kind of fun, exciting.
Yeah, and it's people live almost their entire lives dissociated. It's terrifying to think about the complications of that. Juice writes, Saruman is not pure evil. He made pragmatic and human-ish choices. There's a link there. I think it goes for all other evil characters in Lord of the Ring, up to and including Melkor, a.k.a. Morgoth. And even Frodo is easily corruptible by the ring. There's some interesting stuff in Tolkien's letter number 246. Frodo indeed failed as a hero and conceived by simple trick minds. He did not endure to the end. He gave in. Right? Goes from there.
That's very impressive.
I do like nuanced ways of reading Lord of the Rings, and I think there's pieces there, especially if you go back and read the Silmarillion and flesh things out. But like the vast majority of people who watch that or read it in a binary.
Yeah. And have not read Tolkien's letter number 246, which again is super impressive that you have. Cool.
Adam writes, I remember someone at an old job I worked saying that lessons for kids needed to be like video games, and that was so disturbing. I don't want to manipulate students into learning.
Right. Yeah.
I know the truth in quotes like that speaks to the desire of having the power of being a holder of the truth when you really don't understand why the world is the way it is. Just my way of agreeing with what you were saying about the power of the conspiracy theory.
Right.
Patricia writes, American exceptionalism contributes to the distorted heroic actions in this alternate reality, makes us more susceptible. Yeah, any exception. Every empire's had to have an exceptionalist way of looking at things, and then every supremacist logic does too. And it's completely damaging to our humanity when we're shaped by that, even if we're the ones who benefit from it. CK writes, when the CASE Act is built into the stimulus package, the game is real. I'm not sure what the Case Act is.
Exact is, but yeah, I don't know.
I knew.
If you could get that up within the next 15 seconds, we can find out.
Susan writes, do you think COVID-19 or the vaccine was engineered to make BIPOC people sick? A friend has been hinting at that suspicion. I don't think so.
No, not at all.
I think capitalism is built in such a way that BIPOC people are made sick. And so then any vaccine or pandemic is going to intensify that experience of getting the shitty end of the imperial stick.
Yeah, but see, you know, and the vaccine and all that stuff is another great example of all this. I mean, if you live in this particular game world, you know, and you see COVID as fake, and you know, vaccine as a way to inject microchips so that George Soros can control you, and you know, that's your world view. You know, there's no way of convincing you out of that, right? And that's the thing, is that, you know, and again, I really want to hammer this home as we're getting to the end. Yes, everybody has a formation. Everybody has bias. Everybody has a perspective. But the point is that there are ways of assessing your bias and perspective from the outside. When you're stuck in some particular worldview where you are unwilling to do that, that's when you get lost in these games. That's when you get lost in these worldviews and these mythologies. And that's what the problem is, right? Is that you are not willing to critique anything that you think or say from some external point of view. And as soon as you're not willing to do that, and that's what we're seeing across the board with these Trumpers, when you're not willing to do that, yeah, then you're stuck. Mm-hmm. Because anything that anybody says, if it doesn't agree with you, just becomes an evil part of the game. Right?
A bunch of comments came in at the end. I'm just going to read some of them, and then without commentary, just so you can just put it out there. Catherine writes, instead of following QAnon, I started playing actual D&D during this pandemic. I get my fantasy fix pretending to fight dragons as a genderqueer leftist halfling ranger. Nice. With a group of similarly fantastical companions. Recommended lol. Awesome. Deborah writes, facts exist for COVID. The conspiracy is just that, not reality. CK has a link here for those who are following on Facebook. House Bill 2426. Adam writes, people have good reason to fear the vaccine will harm oppressed communities. That's factual, literal conspiracy. There's been all sorts of shitty medical testing on different marginalized, oppressed groups. So the fear is justifiable.
Absolutely.
Juice writes, I'm a big Tolkien fan. Wink. But yes, I would suggest, even Tolkien himself, from out of his religious Catholic views, struggled with this. On the one side, he was a traditionalist in many ways. At the same time, he embraced a theology of the small and had some sympathy for anarchist views. Our lesson to learn, I would say evil is a system rather than an intrinsic feature of humans. Yeah, this idea of struggling against principalities and powers, I think, is helpful. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could say a lot more about that. Ceres writes, we are willing to submit to the game world, yet we make fun of BIPOC spirituality and science, even if they are more true. Yep. Gus writes, Catherine, D&D, Shadowrun, and games of that like that have much better world building. The present timeline, particularly QAnon, is the worst reality. Ron writes, this was a very fascinating conversation. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Adam writes, people oppressed by white supremacy, POW, heard of that acronym, need a healthy distrust to survive. So it makes things difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we actually heard a great little story yesterday from the Navajo reservation, and a number of Navajo leaders talking about the challenge of getting the vaccine onto the reservation, and a couple of the people that volunteered to take it. And one of the things that one of the tribal leaders said, which I think gets to the core of what we're trying to create in terms of a just society, is that really at the end of the day, what is going to help with this is when Native people are helping to make the vaccine and are not just being oppressed by, white people who have control over the power of all these things. And when we're actually participating as full equals in processes like this. And so I don't remember what show it was on, but it was yesterday afternoon. We were driving, so it was probably about 3:30. So if you want to go on the NPR website and check that out, it was a really good conversation. Very, very bright, engaged people down in the Navajo Nation. All right, this is great. Thanks, everybody. And so we are now going to be off until next Monday.
And so enjoy the holiday for those who do that. And we'll
play lots of games.
Yeah.
See you next week. All right.
Our lives, though. Play the games in your mind.
All right. Love y'all. Bye.